Have you ever thought about, like, what happens when the government needs to acquire land for something like agrarian reform?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Especially here in the Philippines. It's a huge issue right
It
now.
is a huge issue. And it's really complicated. Like, how do you figure out what's fair compensation for the landowner when it's for a greater good?
Right, because you have the rights of the individual landowners and then you have the whole social objective of redistributing land. So how do you balance that?
Exactly. And it's not always clear cut, right? Like, what is just compensation anyway?
It's a big question and it often ends up in court.
It does, and that's what we're going to be diving into today. A fascinating Supreme Court case that really gets to the heart of this whole issue of just compensation for land.
Absolutely. This one's a real legal drama with twists and turns, and it has some big implications for land ownership and agrarian reform here.
So let's get right into it. This case is called Land Bank of the Philippines, Petitioner Vices Milagros De Jesus-Macaraeg, Respondent GR No 244213. And the Supreme Court made their decision on September 14, 2021.
That's right. So buckle up because this is a long one.
It is a long one. So to set the scene, we're talking about a piece of land, a 15-hectare property in Davao City.
Beautiful part of the country.
It is. Owned by a woman named Milagros De Jesus-Macaraeg.
Right.
And back in 2002, a little over half of her land was designated for ARP.
CRP, that's the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program.
Exactly. And that's where the Land Bank of the Philippines comes into play.
They're the ones who handle the money side of things, figuring out how much to pay landowners when their land is acquired for agrarian reform.
Right. And in this case, they initially valued the portion of Milagros land at about P 65,756 per hectare.
Which adds up to about P 472,392 for that portion.
But Milagros, she wasn't having it.
I can imagine.
She rejected the offer, which is totally within her rights. And the land bank, they deposited the money in her name anyway.
Kind of a standard procedure to show they're serious while the legal process plays out.
So then the case went to the DR Adjudication Board, the DARAB.
They're like the referees for agrarian reform disputes trying to settle things administratively.
And in 2003, DR decided that the land was actually worth a lot more, like P1,280,099.
A pretty big jump.
Huge jump, yeah. Land Bank, naturally, they weren't happy about that either.
So what happened next?
They filed a motion for reconsideration, but DR denied it.
So it went up the ladder.
Up to the Regional Trial Court, acting as a Special Agrarian Court, or RTC-SAC. And here's where things get a little interesting, because at this point, Land Bank apparently didn't present their own evidence on how much the land was worth.
That's a bold move.
It is.
Huh.
But Milagros, she did present her side of the story. She had an appraisal done by the Asian Appraisal Corporation, and they valued the land even higher at P 3,055,000.
Wow.
Right. And her husband, Ramon Macaraeg, he testified about how much they could make from growing pineapples on the land.
So they're making a case for the land's potential income.
Exactly. He said they could produce like 46,666 kilos of pineapples per hectare and sell them for P15 a kilo. That's a lot of pineapples.
It is a lot of pineapples. So what did the RTCSAC think about all this?
Well, they ended up siding with Milagros. Big time. They set the just compensation at P20 per square meter. That's way more than what Land Bank offered.
And they even gave her attorney's fees. Ouch!
Yeah, that didn't go Land Bank's way at all. So naturally, they appealed to the Court of Appeals.
Makes sense.
At the Court of Appeals in 2011, they said, hold on a second. They sent the case back to the RTCSC and basically said, you need to redo your math.
They found problems with how the lower court calculated the compensation.
Yeah, they also said no to attorney's fees for now. So it was back to the drawing board for the RTCSAC.
Round two.
Round two. This time, Land Bank, they came back with a new calculation. Using data from the Bureau of Agricultural Statistics, they said the land was worth P 777,880.
That's a pretty different number.
Much lower, yeah. They used a much lower estimate for pineapple production, like around 8,901 kilos per hectare. And a lower selling price, too, like P 7.96 per kilo.
So they were going by official statistics this time.
They were. But the RTC-SAC in 2014, they basically doubled down on their previous decision. They ordered Land Bank to pay P 2,765,727.
Still a lot higher.
Yeah, they used that higher production number from DARAB, but they set their own price per kilo at P5. And they also stuck with that 12% annual interest.
Land Bank must have been pulling their hair out.
I know, right? They tried to get the RTC-SAC to reconsider, but no dice. So back to the Court of Appeals they went, again.
This case is really bouncing around the legal system.
It is. And in 2018, the Court of Appeals, they reversed what the RTC-SAC had decided. They said the P5 per kilo selling price was arbitrary, and they went with P2.50 per kilo instead.
Closer to land bank's initial offer.
Right. They also changed how they calculated the market value of the land, using the assessed value and guidelines from DARAB Administrative Order Number 5.
So trying to bring things more in line with established procedures?
Yeah, but here's the thing. They actually agreed with that higher annual gross production figure, the 46,666 kilos.
Even though land bank's data was lower.
Yeah, the Court of Appeals pointed out that it was even lower than what DARAB had used. In the end, they set the compensation at P1,271,523 minus the initial deposit. And they applied a 6% annual interest rate based on a Supreme Court case called NAGCAR versus Gallery Frames, which sets guidelines for legal interest.
So mixed bag for land bank, but still not what they were hoping for?
Definitely not. They tried again to get the Court of Appeals to reconsider, but again, no luck. So finally, this case made it to the big leagues, the Supreme Court.
The ultimate showdown.
It was. The big question before the Supreme Court was whether the Court of Appeals had got it right on the money.
Pun intended.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Did they calculate just compensation correctly, especially when it came to those pineapple figures?
The annual gross production and the selling price, they were all over the place.
They were, and the Supreme Court had to sort it out.
Yeah.
Land bank, they were arguing against that high production number. Milagros, on the other hand, she was actually arguing for an even higher compensation based on some agreement in a similar case.
Wow, so everyone's still fighting for their piece of the pie.
They are. So what did the Supreme Court say?
Well, they got into the weeds.
They did.
And they partly agreed with land bank. They said the RTC-SAC has the main job of figuring out just compensation, but they have to follow the rules. Meaning they have to look at all the factors in Section 17 of RA 666507, which is the CARP law, and they have to use the formula in DARAB 5.
Makes sense.
Because there wasn't enough reliable data on similar land sales, that formula basically says you take 90% of the capitalized net income of the land and add 10% of its market value.
So it's a combination of the land's income potential and its straight-up market value.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court agreed with the Court of Appeals on the market value, which was about P20,012 per hectare. Nobody was really arguing about that anymore.
Right. That annual gross production, that was a different story.
They really scrutinized that.
They did. And they said the Court of Appeals was wrong to go with that unverified number from Milagros' husband.
The 46,666 kilos per hectare.
Yeah. They said you have to look at the most recent 12 months of production before the government did their investigation back in May 2002.
So using official data.
And according to the Bureau of Agricultural Statistics, that number was actually way lower. Only 8,901.28 kilos per hectare, which is in line with DARAB now.
So they're emphasizing the importance of using verified data.
They are. And then there's the selling price.
The other big variable.
Right. The Supreme Court pointed out that while the Court of Appeals had lowered the RTCSAC's number, Land Bank themselves had consistently been using a figure of P7.96 per kilo based on those Bureau of Agricultural Statistics numbers.
After the case went back and forth.
Yeah. So the Supreme Court said, Land Bank, you're stuck with that number now.
Because they had been using it consistently.
Exactly.
Wow.
So with those numbers in hand, they recalculated everything. They used the 8,901.28 kilos for production and P7.96 for the selling price. They also had to assume a net income rate of 20% because there wasn't clear data on operating costs. And that gave them a capitalized net income of about P118,090 per hectare.
So they plugged that into the formula along with the market value.
And that resulted in a land value of P108,282.58 per hectare. Multiply that by the 7 hectares under CRP, and you get a total just compensation of P777,880.40.
The final verdict.
The final verdict after almost 2 decades of legal back and forth.
Quite a journey.
It is, and it raises so many questions.
It does. Like, what does this all mean for agrarian reform in the Philippines?
Right. Is this really just compensation?
Especially after all that time and all those different valuations.
It's something for all of us to think about.
And for our listeners, too. What stood out to you in this case?
What did you find most interesting? What are your takeaways?
Let us know in the comments.
We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And before we go, let's recap some of the key legal principles we've covered.
Sounds good.
First, we learned that just compensation in agrarian reform isn't just about the market value of the land. It's also about making sure landowners get paid in a timely manner.
Because they're losing potential income while they wait.
Exactly. Then there's Section 17 of RA 6657 and DARAB 5. These are like the rule books for figuring out just compensation under CRP.
They lay out the factors and the formula that everyone has to follow.
Right. And we talked about capitalized net income, or CNI. That's a way to value agricultural land based on how much money it can potentially generate.
Like how much you could make from those pineapples.
Exactly. And finally, we have NACAR versus gallery frames, which sets the rules for how legal interest is calculated here in the Philippines.
So lots to think about, lots to learn from this case.
It really shows how complex these issues can be.
It does. And if you're interested in learning more about Philippine law and how it shapes our lives, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive for more deep dives like this one.
We'll keep bringing you the most fascinating legal cases and breaking them down in a way that everyone can understand.
Stay informed, stay engaged.
And join us next time.